A soldier's final flight home turns into a desperate race against fate. As turbulence shakes the plane, he sends one last message to the love of his life. A message that could be the last words she ever hears from him. Will he make it back? Or is this goodbye forever? The first rays of sunlight had barely broken through the darkness when Captain James Mitchell stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his uniform with meticulous care. The crisp folds of his military dress seemed almost out of place in the quiet serenity of their home. He ran his fingers over the fabric, checking that everything was perfect. It was a ritual he had followed countless times before. But today it felt different. Today, as he buttoned up his jacket, it was the weight of the goodbye that pressed on his chest. From downstairs, the sound of soft footsteps reached his ears. Sarah, his wife, was already awake, as she always was on mornings like this morning's. When he had to leave again, the house felt unusually still, as though the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for the moment of separation, the moment when they would say goodbye, once again. For what felt like the millionth time, James caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror. The face staring back at him was tired. There were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of rest could erase. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks now, but no amount of planning could prepare him for the ache in his chest. The overwhelming sense of loss that had already begun to settle in. He couldn't bear to look at his phone. He knew what was on the screen, even though he hadn't checked it yet. A message from Sarah. He'd received it this morning, but he was avoiding it, hoping that, maybe, just maybe, if he didn't read it, he wouldn't have to face the overwhelming reality of what was happening. But the truth was inescapable. He had to leave, and the moment was drawing nearer. With a sigh, he set his uniform straight and headed downstairs, trying to push the knot of anxiety that had formed in his stomach. He was no stranger to goodbyes. As an army officer, they were part of the job, expected, even routine. But with Sarah, it was different. Every goodbye felt like an emotional fracture, a piece of him left behind each time. As James reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw Sarah in the kitchen, her back to him as she made coffee. The soft glow of the early morning light bathed her in a golden hue, and for a moment, he simply stood there, watching her. It was in moments like these, when the world felt still, that he appreciated the quiet grace she had always shown him. She was the calm in the storm of his life, the one constant that kept him grounded. Even when the winds of uncertainty were blowing fiercely around him. Sarah turned around as she heard his footsteps. Her face softened when she saw him, and her eyes filled with the same mixture of love and sorrow that mirrored his own. Without a word, she walked over to him, pulling him into a tight embrace. It was a familiar gesture, one that had become almost routine over the years. But this time, it was different. There was an unspoken understanding between them. They both knew this wasn't just another goodbye. "I'm going to miss you so much," Sarah whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. She had always been strong, the pillar of their relationship, but today, she allowed herself to lean on him. If only for a moment. James pulled her closer, inhaling the familiar scent of her hair. It was the scent of home, of warmth, of safety, of everything he had ever wanted in his life. He didn't want to leave her, not today, not ever. But duty called, and duty, for better or worse, always came first. "I'll be back before you." "No, he said softly, though even he could hear the tremor in his voice. The words sounded hollow, as though he were trying to convince himself more than her. Sarah pulled away slightly, looking up at him with tears brimming in her eyes. She tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her lips. It's never easy, James. Every time, it gets harder. Every time you leave, I wonder if this will be the last time." The words hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't saying anything new. He had heard these fears before. But today, they felt sharper, more real. He couldn't bear the thought of her thinking that. He reached up and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a stray tear that had fallen. "It won't be the last time," he promised, though he knew deep down that he couldn't guarantee that. "I'll come back to you, Sarah. I swear." She nodded, her lips trembling as she tried to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "I know. I wish you didn't have to go." James kissed her forehead, feeling the warmth of her skin against his lips. He wished, too. He wished more than anything that he could stay, that he could hold her in his arms and never have to let go. But this was the life they had chosen. This was the reality of being with someone who wore the uniform of their country. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the sound of their breathing. They didn't need to say anything more. They both understood the gravity of the moment, the finality of it. the uncertainty of what lay ahead. With one last lingering kiss, James pulled away and walked toward the door. He grabbed his duffel bag, slinging it over his shoulder, and turned to face Sarah once more. "I'll be back," he said, more firmly this time, trying to push away the doubts that had begun to cloud his mind. "Just wait for me. I love you." Sarah stood still, her hands pressed against her chest, her eyes locked on his. "I love you, too. Always." The drive to the airport was quiet. The usual chatter, the small talk that kept them distracted from the weight of the goodbye, was absent. Both of them knew there was nothing they could say that would make the situation any easier. They were approaching the inevitable, and no amount of words would change that. As they arrived at the airport, the reality of the situation set in. It was a place filled with comings and goings, arrivals and departures. But for James and Sarah, it was always the same goodbye. It didn't matter how many times they had done this. It never got any easier. James pulled the car to a stop near the entrance, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He looked over at Sarah, her face soft with sadness. Her hand rested on the door handle, but she didn't move. "I'll be fine," James said. Though the words sounded hollow even to him, he wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure her, himself. Sarah smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made his heart ache. "I know. Just come back safe. That's all I need." With a final kiss, James stepped out of the car, grabbing his bag from the back seat. Sarah watched him walk away, feeling the familiar emptiness settle in. As he disappeared into the terminal, she sat still, staring at the place where he had just been. It was never easy, but it was their life. And for better or worse, it was a life they had chosen together. James sat in his seat, the seatbelt fastened tightly across his chest, as the airplane began to climb. The steady hum of the engines was a sound he had grown used to, a sound that had accompanied him through countless flights during his military career. He could feel the vibrations in his body as the plane soared into the sky, cutting through the clouds like a bird on a determined flight path. The world below them grew smaller, more distant, as if the ground was pulling away from his feet, taking with it all the weight of the goodbyes he had just said. As the plane climbed higher, James gazed out of the small oval window beside him. The sprawling city below was now a collection of tiny lights and streets, a patchwork quilt of life continuing in the distance. The deeper he looked into the horizon, the more his thoughts turned inward. His mind wandered back to Sarah, to her soft, tear-streaked face, as she watched him walk away. The memory of her eyes, filled with both love and sadness, lingered in his mind, unwilling to be shaken off. "She was the light of my life," he thought, a pang of longing hitting his chest. "What would I do without her?" James leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to clear his mind. He had never been afraid of flying. He had crossed oceans and mountains in the pursuit of duty, and had always emerged on the other side unharmed. But something felt different today, something that he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but there was an underlying sense of unease, a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach that something wasn't right. The plane jolted suddenly, a sharp, unexpected lurch that sent James' heart into his throat. He gripped the armrests, his palms sweating as he tried to steady himself. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the faces of the other passengers. Some of them were startled, others seemed unbothered, lost in their own worlds. The flight attendants remained calm, moving through the cabin as if nothing had happened. It was just turbulence, he told himself, trying to dismiss the unease that was building inside him. Turbulence was nothing new. They'd be fine. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a strange stillness in the air, an unsettling quietness that seemed to stretch through the cabin. The sound of the engines grew louder for a moment, before returning to their usual hum. James' mind wandered to Sarah again, and he pulled out his phone, eager for some connection to her. He had promised her that this would be a short trip, that he would return soon. But he also knew how fragile life was. Every time he left her, there was a part of him that wondered if it might be the last time he would see her. James quickly typed a message, his fingers hovering over the keys. "I love you. I'll be home soon. Just a bit of turbulence. Nothing to worry about." He hit send, watching as the message flew off into the ether. Bound for the phone he knew was sitting on the kitchen counter at home. For a moment, he felt a wave of reassurance. He had told her not to worry. It was just a small bump in the road. But as the plane continued its ascent, the turbulence began to grow stronger. The gentle rocking that had once been soothing was now more jarring, unsettling, as if the plane itself was struggling to maintain its altitude. The fastened seatbelt sign lit up, and James tightened his grip on the armrests once more. His eyes scanned the cabin again, and he noticed a few of the other passengers were visibly nervous now. Some were gripping the seat in front of them, while others stared ahead with a distant, worried expression. The overhead lights flickered briefly before returning to full brightness. The calm, soothing voice of the flight attendant came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are currently experiencing some turbulence. We apologize for the inconvenience and ask that you keep your seatbelts fastened at all times. We will get through this shortly." The flight attendants walked down the aisle, trying to reassure the passengers with their calm presence. James tried to breathe through his rising anxiety, but the knot in his stomach tightened, and his thoughts turned darker. This isn't just turbulence, he thought. This is something more. He looked out the window again, watching the clouds swirl beneath the plane. The sky had turned from a clear blue to a dark, ominous shade of gray, and he could feel the weight of the atmosphere pressing in around him. His instincts, honed over years of military service, told him something was wrong. Another sudden jolt caused the plane to drop sharply, and James felt his stomach lurch in response. It wasn't just a small bump now. It was as though the plane had lost control for a split second, sending everyone inside into a collective gasp. This was more than turbulence. James closed his eyes for a moment, gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles were turning white. His thoughts turned to Sarah again, her face, her voice, the way she had kissed him goodbye this morning, the way she had begged him to promise he would come back safe. He had promised her, but now, in the midst of the chaos unfolding around him, that promise felt fragile, like a thread about to snap. The plane continued to lurch violently, as if struggling to stay in the air. The overhead panels rattled with each bump, and the lights flickered again. James could hear the faint sound of passengers murmuring, their voices rising in fear. The plane was shaking more now, the vibrations causing his teeth to rattle. He pulled out his phone again, hoping to send another reassuring message to Sarah, but as he unlocked the screen, the signal cut out. The screen remained frozen, and the absence of the familiar connection sent a jolt of panic through him. He tried again, but the signal was still lost. At that moment, the captain's voice came through the intercom, but it was strained, garbled, as if the static itself were trying to drown out the urgency in his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a mechanical issue with the aircraft. We are descending to a lower altitude and will update you as soon as possible. Please remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened." James felt a chill run down his spine. Mechanical issue, descending. The words, simple as they were, had a weight to them that spoke of something far more serious than just turbulence. The atmosphere inside the cabin grew tense, and James could hear the low murmur of panic spreading among the passengers. The plane dipped again, more sharply this time, and the cabin lights flickered once more. The sound of the engines sputtered, growing faint and erratic. James closed his eyes again, praying though he wasn't sure to whom. All he wanted was to see Sarah again, to hold her, to keep his promise. But in that moment, the promise felt impossibly far away. The moment the captain's voice came over the intercom again, James' heart sank. It wasn't just another update about turbulence, it was a warning. The tension that had gripped the cabin since the plane first started shaking had turned into a thick, suffocating silence. The lights flickered again, briefly plunging the cabin into darkness, before returning with a faint, flickering hum. James swallowed hard as he tightened his grip on the armrest. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice was sharp and urgent, though still attempting to maintain a professional calm. "We're experiencing severe mechanical difficulties. We are descending rapidly to a lower altitude for safety. Please remain in your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and prepare for an emergency landing. This is not a drill. We will update you with more information as we proceed." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. An emergency landing. His thoughts immediately shot to Sarah. What if I don't make it? The question echoed in his mind, louder than the sound of the plane's shuddering body. What if this was the last flight he would ever take? What if the promise he had made to Sarah to come home safely was one he couldn't keep? The plane dipped again, more sharply than before, and the sound of the engines sputtered, giving off a faint, sickening whine. The entire cabin tilted, sending some passengers into a terrified frenzy as they struggled to hold on to their seatbelts. There were muffled cries, whispered prayers, and the unmistakable sound of people holding their breath. James gripped the seat harder, his knuckles white. His stomach was doing flip-flops, but his mind couldn't focus on the physical discomfort. His thoughts were consumed by the overwhelming fear of the unknown. The uncertainty was unbearable. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was just going home. He was supposed to walk through the door of their home, to feel Sarah's warm embrace, to hear her voice once again. Instead, he was hurtling towards something he couldn't control. Stay calm, he whispered to himself, as if those words could somehow prevent the inevitable. You've been in worse situations. You've come out alive before. This is just another obstacle, another mission to get through. But the thought offered no comfort. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and his heart leaped in his chest. The momentary hope that it was Sarah's message vanished as he checked the screen. No, it wasn't from her. It was a notification about the flight. He felt a sickening sense of loss. The one person he wanted to hear from, the one person he needed to hear from, was unreachable. The absence of her name on the screen felt like an omen. It was as if the world was shutting him out, and he was completely alone. James swallowed again, this time harder. His fingers trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The connection barely there. The signal weak. He didn't care. He needed to try. He needed to send her one last message, one last piece of his heart, just in case. His hands shook as he quickly typed, Sarah, if you're reading this, know that I love you more than anything. Please know that, no matter what happens, I am forever yours. I've spent my life fighting for things I believe in, but you are the most important thing to me. You are my reason for everything. I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise to come home. His fingers hovered over the screen. His heart pounded against his chest, and the world around him seemed to blur. It wasn't just fear now, it was a deep, aching sorrow. He was saying goodbye, without actually saying the words. His message was as much a farewell as it was a love letter, a final testament to the life they had shared, the love they had built together. He hit send, the message flying off into the ether. For a moment, he stared at the blank screen, waiting for a reply that would never come. He had no idea what was going on outside the plane, but he could feel the acceleration of their descent. A heavy pressure pushing down on his chest. The noise of the engines, once a steady hum, was now a jagged, uneven roar. The turbulence hadn't let up. It had only worsened, sending the passengers into a panic. The plane lurched again, this time with such force that James had to clutch the armrests harder to avoid being thrown from his seat. His seatbelt dug into his waist as the pressure continued to build, making it nearly impossible to breathe. He could hear the woman beside him gasp in fear, her hand clutching the seatbelt, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't the only one. The cabin was filled with the sound of gasps and cries, and James could see people across the aisle praying, some even crying silently. Is this how it ends? The thought refused to leave him. It hung in the air like a dark cloud, hovering just above the chaos. It seemed impossible that he could be in this situation. He had fought in wars, been through countless dangerous situations, but this was different. The realization struck him like a ton of bricks. They weren't just experiencing turbulence or a mechanical malfunction. Something had gone terribly wrong, and they were no longer in control. He closed his eyes, his body tense, as the plane shuddered violently again. The pressure in his chest was unbearable, and the sudden loss of altitude made his stomach flip. The sound of the plane's structure groaning, the metal twisting under strain, was terrifying. It felt as though the entire aircraft was falling apart around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He thought of Sarah again, of her face, her smile, her laughter. He thought of all the quiet moments they had shared, watching the sunset from their front porch, walking hand in hand down quiet streets, and the simple joy of just being with her. She had been his anchor, his reason for everything. And now, as he sat helplessly in this plane, plummeting through the sky, all he could think about was her dot. The world around him was spinning. The lights flickered again, the cabin plunged into darkness for a split second, and then, once again, the emergency lights flickered on. The loudspeakers blared with an emergency announcement from the captain, though it was distorted and unintelligible. The passengers were now panicking, in earnest mothers were clutching their children. People were whispering prayers, and some were visibly shaking. James took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This was it. There was nothing more to be done. Sarah sat in their living room, her fingers lightly tapping against the armrest of the couch. As the clock ticked away the seconds, each one seeming louder than the last. It had been hours since James' flight was supposed to have landed, and yet, she hadn't received a single word from him. The creeping anxiety that had settled in her chest since the early morning had only intensified as the day wore on. She tried to keep busy, folding laundry, tidying up, doing anything to keep her mind from spiraling into the thoughts she couldn't avoid. But no matter how many times she looked at her phone, there was nothing. No message. No missed call. Nothing. The sound of the clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence, as if it were mocking her. She hadn't heard from him since the brief text he had sent earlier that day, telling her not to worry. That the turbulence was nothing, and that he'd be home soon. But the feeling in her gut, that terrible gnawing sensation, told her something wasn't right. It always told her the truth. She walked over to the kitchen counter where her phone sat, waiting in its usual spot. The screen flickered to life as she picked it up, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the notification. A message from James. Her hands shook as she opened it, breath catching in her throat. But the words that appeared on the screen sent an icy chill through her. Sarah, if you're reading this, know that I love you more than anything. Please know that, no matter what happens, I am forever yours. I've spent my life fighting for things I believe in, but you are the most important thing to me. You were my reason for everything. I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise to come home. The room spun, the world around her blurring as the words melted into the very air she breathed. No, she thought, no. Her hand trembled violently as she read and reread the message, her mind refusing to accept what was right in front of her. This couldn't be happening. Not James. Her stomach churned as a wave of nausea hit her, and she collapsed onto the kitchen chair, staring at the phone in disbelief. The text message was short, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime. The fear, the sorrow in his words, it was all too much. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Before she could gather herself, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a call. Her heart leaped in her chest, hoping, praying that it was James. That maybe, just maybe, he had sent the message as some sort of mistake, or that it had been sent by accident. But when she saw the unknown number on the screen, her hope faltered. Her hand hovered over the screen, unsure if she could bring herself to answer, but something deep inside told her she needed to. With shaking hands, she answered the call. Hello. Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with fear. Mrs. Mitchell. The voice on the other end was calm, and it sent a jolt of panic through her. This is Officer Davis with the National Transportation Safety Board. I regret to inform you that we've experienced a serious incident involving Flight 476J. The aircraft has crashed, and there are no survivors. The world around Sarah seemed to collapse into itself. The words felt like a hammer, each syllable crushing her chest further, squeezing the life out of her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only hear the distant sound of the officer's voice, telling her things that she couldn't comprehend. No, she choked out, her breath coming in shallow gasps. No, this can't be true. My husband, he was on that plane. I'm very sorry, ma'am. The officer's voice was soft, but the weight of his words cut through her like a blade. I understand this is difficult, but please know that the airline will be in contact with you shortly to provide more details. I know this is not the news you were expecting, but we wanted to inform you as soon as possible. Sarah could barely process the words. She felt like she was drowning, and no matter how much she struggled to breathe, the air kept slipping away from her. James, he was gone. He was never coming home. Her entire world shattered in that moment, the pieces scattering around her, leaving nothing but emptiness. The phone call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah sitting in silence, staring at the now blank screen of her phone. Her mind was frozen, struggling to process what had just happened. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But the text message, the phone call, the officer's words, they were undeniable. James was gone. The grief hit her in waves, overwhelming and suffocating. She sank to the floor, clutching her chest as sobs racked her body. Her tears flowed freely, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. James, the love of her life, was gone, and she was left with nothing but memories, messages, and a promise that would never be kept. Why him? She thought through her tears. Why James? She had known the risks when she married him. She had known the uncertainty, the separation, the long stretches of time without him. But she had always believed that, somehow, they would make it through. That the universe would bring him home, just as it always had. But now, that wasn't going to happen. He was gone. Sarah stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her, and walked toward their bedroom. Everything in the house seemed eerily quiet, as if it, too, had felt the impact of the tragedy. She stood in the doorway of their room and looked at the empty bed, at the pillows they had shared, at the space he used to occupy. That this was the hardest part, the silence, the absence of him, the absence of his presence, the realization that he wouldn't walk through the door again. She reached for his jacket, still hanging on the chair by the door, the one he had worn when he left this morning. She clutched it to her chest, inhaling deeply, as if doing so could somehow bring him back. But the reality was harsh. There would be no more goodbyes. No more promises of coming home. The space beside her was empty, and it always would be now. As Sarah held his jacket, her fingers brushing against the fabric, she felt an overwhelming rush of love for him, mingled with the deepest sorrow she had ever known. He was everything to me, she thought, her breath shaky. He was my world. With a broken heart, she sank to her knees, still clutching the jacket to her chest, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her. In the midst of the pain, there was a single, undeniable truth. He had loved her, and she would carry that love with her forever. But for now, she was left alone with memories, messages, and the life they could never have.